The most feared warriors in the medieval world didn't lose sleep over enemy swords or rival kingdoms. They feared something that came every year, without warning, without mercy, and without any interest in how brave you were. They feared winter. Not the idea of winter, not the inconvenience of cold, but the specific, calculated brutality of an Arctic season that could erase a family, a village, a generation, not in battle, but in silence, in the dark, while they slept. Here is the question that should stop you. How does a civilization without central heating, without insulation technology, without modern medicine, not just survive temperatures that freeze exposed skin in under 4 minutes, but thrive for centuries in some of the coldest inhabited places on Earth? The answer does not begin with fire. It does not begin with fur. It begins with a decision made every single autumn, a decision that determined, with brutal precision, who would still be breathing when spring finally returned. And once you understand what that decision was, you will never look at winter, or at preparation, the same way again. Forget what you think you know about Viking Age Scandinavia. Strip away the mythology, the helmets, the longships cutting through fog. What remains is a landscape that actively tried to kill the people who lived in it, and did so, reliably, every single year. Winter in Norse territories did not arrive gently. It arrived like a door slamming shut on the world. Snow fell in October and held the land hostage until May. In parts of Norway and Iceland, the sun didn't simply set. It disappeared entirely for weeks, leaving communities inside a darkness so complete it pressed against the walls of your home like something alive. Temperatures in Viking Age Scandinavia regularly fell below -20 degrees Celsius. In inland valleys and northern settlements, conditions could reach far colder. At those temperatures, the physics of survival become unforgiving. Exposed skin begins to freeze within minutes. Wet clothing becomes a death sentence. Disorientation in a whiteout storm, the kind that could erase a familiar path in a single afternoon, meant exposure. And exposure, in this environment, almost always meant you did not come home. Archaeological and historical records suggest that winter mortality was a consistent, documented reality for Norse communities. This was not occasional tragedy. It was structural, seasonal, expected, and yet, they did not disappear. They built, they adapted, they endured not one winter, but hundreds of generations of winters, refining survival into something that looked, from the outside, almost like ordinary life. But it was never ordinary. Every fire, every meal, every garment, every word spoken in the dark was part of a system built not around comfort, but around the single non-negotiable goal of still being alive when the ice finally broke. So what did that system look like? It started with the ground beneath their feet, and the walls they chose to build around themselves. Forget the romantic image of Vikings huddled in drafty wooden huts, praying for the wind to stop. That image is not just wrong, it is the opposite of the truth. The Viking Longhouse was not a shelter. It was a thermal machine, engineered across centuries of trial, failure, and brutal consequence, by people who understood one thing with absolute clarity: a building that leaked heat was a building that killed its occupants. The walls were constructed using wattle and daub, a composite system of interwoven branches packed with layers of clay, crushed straw, and animal hair. This was not primitive construction. This was deliberate material science. Each component trapped air. Each layer slowed heat transfer. The result was a wall that didn't just block wind. It actively resisted the cold attempting to move through it. Over these walls, thick layers of turf and sod were added. Archaeological excavations at Stong in Iceland, a Norse farmstead buried and preserved by a volcanic eruption in approximately 1104 AD, revealed turf walls reaching up to 1.5 meters in thickness. That mass of earth did something no thin wooden wall could do. It absorbed warmth from the interior hearth during daylight hours and released it slowly, steadily, through the night, stabilizing interior temperatures even as the world outside plunged toward dangerous cold. Researchers studying Norse building archaeology suggest interior temperatures in well-constructed longhouses may have remained between 15 and 18 degrees Celsius, even when outside temperatures dropped to -20. Not because of brute fire, Because of design. The proportions of the longhouse itself were never accidental. Low ceilings prevented warm air from rising and escaping. Compact interior volumes concentrated heat around the people who needed it. Every beam, every packed earth floor, every layer of sod worked together as a single integrated system. This is the same principle behind passive house architecture, a building standard developed in the 1970s and celebrated as modern innovation. The Vikings arrived at the same conclusion roughly 1,000 years earlier, not through theory, through the elimination of every design that got people killed. At the center of every longhouse burned a fire that was never allowed to die. Not because of sentiment, not because of tradition, because letting it die was a decision you might not survive. The hearth was positioned deliberately along the central axis of the longhouse, a placement that allowed rising warmth to spread outward in both directions through the shared living space. Low ceilings trapped that warmth before it could escape. The structure itself became a circulation system, guiding heat downward and outward, holding it close to the bodies that depended on it. Smoke presented a genuine problem. Unlike later structures built with tall chimneys that drew air upward and expelled warmth along with combustion gases, Viking longhouses managed smoke through small roof vents and gaps beneath the eaves. Some smoke remained inside. It darkened the ceiling beams. It stung the eyes. It left residue on everything. But here is what most accounts overlook: that smoke was not purely a cost. Archaeological analysis of preserved longhouse timbers has shown that the smoke coating on interior wood significantly slowed decay and insect damage, potentially extending the structural life of the building by decades. What appeared to be an unavoidable trade-off was, in practice, an additional benefit. The earth floor, the packed clay walls, the wooden frames, all of these absorbed heat during the hours the fire burned at full intensity. When the flames dimmed toward morning, these materials released that stored warmth back into the space. The interior temperature did not collapse when the fire dropped. It held. This is thermal mass, a principle now fundamental to sustainable architecture. The Vikings did not name it. They did not write equations describing it, but they understood it in the way that only extended consequence can teach, through the slow accumulation of knowledge about what kept people alive and the equally clear memory of what had not. They did not heat a room. They heated a system. And that distinction between solving a problem and building something that makes 1,000 future problems irrelevant is the difference between surviving one winter and surviving 100. In the cold, clothing is not fashion. It is the last barrier between your body and your environment that is actively trying to lower your core temperature to a point where your organs stop functioning. The Vikings understood this with a precision that modern material science has only recently been able to fully explain. Wool was the foundation of everything, not by preference, by necessity. Unlike cotton or linen, which collapse as insulators the moment they absorb moisture, trapping cold water against the skin instead of air, wool retains approximately 80% of its insulating capacity, even when completely saturated. In a climate where snow, sea spray, and freezing rain were daily realities, this single property made wool the difference between manageable cold and fatal cold. Animal hides and furs added a second layer of defense built on a different principle. Dense outer fur deflected wind and shed moisture. Softer inner layers held warm air directly against the skin. Together, they created a system that addressed cold from two directions simultaneously, blocking it from outside while preserving the heat the body itself generated from within. Layering was not optional. Multiple wool tunics were worn together, each trapping a thin pocket of air between them. Heavy outer cloaks sealed the system against wind penetration. Mittens and hoods protected the hands and head, the 2 points where the human body loses heat fastest, and where the consequences of exposure arrive first. Leather boots were packed with dry straw or compressed felt, creating insulation between the foot and frozen ground that prevented conductive heat loss through direct contact with ice and soil. But here is what the garments themselves do not reveal. A single complete set of winter clothing required an estimated 200 to 400 hours of hand labor to produce. Spinning, weaving, curing, stitching. What you wore into the cold was not a jacket. It was someone's entire season of work. You didn't lose clothing to carelessness. You lost months of labor. You lost warmth that could not be quickly replaced. In that context, every garment carried a weight beyond fabric. It carried the cost of survival made visible. Here is a truth that winter teaches without mercy. The food you eat in January was decided in July. In Viking Age communities, the relationship between preparation and survival was not philosophical. It was arithmetical, precise, unforgiving. Every calorie stored before the first snow fell was a calorie available when the land offered nothing, when hunting became dangerous, when the ground was frozen solid, when the sea was locked under ice. Months before winter arrived, families worked with disciplined urgency to preserve every available resource. Fish and meat were smoked over controlled fires or dried in cold Arctic air. Salt, a traded commodity of genuine value in Norse society, was used to cure meat and prevent decay through the long months ahead. Among the most reliable winter foods was stockfish, cod preserved through natural air drying in the cold Norwegian climate. Historical trade records from as early as the 12th century document stockfish as a major Norse export commodity, and the preservation method itself is considerably older. Properly dried stockfish can remain edible for 2 to 3 years without any additional treatment, a nutritional anchor that could sustain a community through an extended winter or a failed hunting season. Vegetables were preserved in brine, milk was transformed into skyr, aged cheese, and fermented dairy products capable of surviving months without refrigeration. Nothing was discarded, nothing was taken for granted, but beyond the practical mechanics of preservation, something more fundamental was at work. In Norse culture, waste was not simply inefficiency. Waste was a moral failure, a violation of the collective responsibility that held communities together through the season that most threatened to pull them apart. The discipline of preservation was inseparable from the ethics of survival. You preserved food not only for yourself. You preserved it because others were depending on the same calculation being made correctly. Every meal eaten in the dark of February was borrowed from a version of yourself who had the discipline, in the warmth of summer, to prepare. Every bite was an act of foresight made edible. Remember the question placed at the beginning of this journey: what kept them sane when the sun disappeared for weeks at a time? This is the answer. Modern clinical research now identifies seasonal affective disorder, the psychological deterioration triggered by prolonged absence of natural light, as a condition affecting an estimated 10% of the population in Northern Europe today. In Scandinavia, where winter darkness is most extreme, that figure climbs higher. Disrupted sleep cycles, declining motivation, a heaviness that settles into the mind, the way cold settles into uninsulated walls, gradually, then completely. The Vikings faced this without a name for it, without treatment, without any scientific framework to explain why the darkness felt like it was doing something to them from the inside. And yet they did not collapse under it. What they built instead was not a medical solution, it was a human one. The longhouse hearth became something beyond a heat source. It became the gravitational center of psychological survival. Families gathered close, not only for warmth, but for the specific, irreplaceable medicine of human presence. Hands stayed in motion. Wool was spun and woven. Bone and wood were carved into tools, into objects, into things that would outlast the winter and prove that time had not simply been endured but used. Norse skaldic poetry, a highly structured oral tradition requiring years of disciplined memorization, was not entertainment in any casual sense. It was functional technology, complex verses preserved genealogies, navigation knowledge, seasonal wisdom, and the accumulated experience of generations in a form the human memory could reliably carry across time. When a skald recited in the firelight, they were not performing. They were maintaining a living archive that no storm could destroy and no frost could reach. But beyond knowledge preservation, something more essential was happening inside those walls. Stories reminded people of who they were when the darkness suggested they were nothing. They did not tell stories to pass the time. They told stories to remind each other that they were worth saving. And in that act, repeated every winter, in every longhouse, across every generation, they built something no turf wall could provide, the collective will to still be there when the light returned. Survival inside the longhouse was a system of conservation. Survival outside it was a system of calculated risk. Winter did not permit stillness. Food stores depleted. Hunting opportunities appeared and vanished with the weather. Waiting too long meant starvation. Moving without judgment meant exposure. The Norse winter demanded a specific kind of intelligence. Not courage, not strength, but the ability to read an environment that was continuously trying to mislead you. To move across deep snow, Vikings relied on wooden skis, a technology far older than the Viking Age itself. The Overfoss ski, discovered in Norway, has been dated to approximately 3,300 years before the Common Era, placing ski technology in Scandinavia thousands of years before the Viking period. By the time Norse hunters moved across winter terrain, they were working with a tool refined across millennia of use. These were not primitive planks. They were precision instruments, shaped to distribute weight across unstable snow surfaces and allow efficient movement through terrain that would trap an unprepared traveler within minutes. Reindeer, elk, hare, and seal were pursued with patience that modern hunting culture rarely demands. Weapons, longbows, spears, purpose-built for winter conditions, were instruments of survival before they were instruments of warfare. But the weapons mattered less than the knowledge carried by the hunter using them. Reading snow texture revealed how recently an animal had passed. Wind direction indicated where prey was likely to shelter. Subtle changes in light on the horizon suggested incoming storms with enough lead time to change a decision, to hunt further or to turn back. This knowledge was never written. It existed only in the minds of those who had learned it from those who had learned it before them, passing through generations not as text, but as demonstrated practice, as watched behavior, as the memory of what had happened to those who had guessed wrong. Every hunter who left the longhouse understood the only two outcomes available: return with food, or don't return. There was no middle ground that winter was willing to offer. When spring finally returned to Norse territories, when daylight stretched back across the frozen ground and ice retreated from the coastlines, it did not arrive as a victory. It arrived as confirmation. Confirmation that the system had held, that the decisions made in summer had been correct, that the walls had been thick enough, the food stores deep enough, the fire tended carefully enough, the community held together tightly enough to carry everyone through to the other side of the dark. What the Vikings built across centuries of Arctic winters was not a collection of survival tricks. It was something more coherent and more profound than that. Their architecture was applied thermodynamics, heat managed, directed, and preserved through design principles that passive house engineers would rediscover nearly a millennium later. Their clothing was applied material science, layered systems engineered to maintain body temperature across the specific conditions of their environment. Their food preservation was applied chemistry, salt, cold, fermentation, and drying, transformed into a nutritional infrastructure capable of sustaining life through months of scarcity. Their community rituals were applied psychology, human connection, purposeful work, and oral tradition deployed as deliberate defenses against the mental deterioration that prolonged darkness reliably produces. None of this was accidental. All of it was tested. Everything that failed had already been eliminated by the cold itself, the most honest and unforgiving evaluator that has ever existed. Here is what that leaves us with. They did not build solutions, they built systems. And the difference matters more than it might appear. A solution fixes one problem. A system survives 1,000 problems you haven't encountered yet. We live in a world that has engineered away most of what they feared. Temperature is a dial we turn. Darkness is a switch we flip. Food is a store we visit without thinking about July. But something in us still recognizes this knowledge. Because it was never written in books. It was written in cold, in hunger, in the long dark, in the bones of people who looked at one of the most hostile environments on Earth and decided, with extraordinary quiet determination, that they were not going to disappear. That decision, made every autumn, renewed every winter, confirmed every spring, is a form of intelligence that no amount of modern comfort has made irrelevant. It has only made it easier to forget. The Vikings mastered winter through architecture, clothing, food, and the deliberate preservation of human community. But 5,000 miles away, across a different continent, another people were solving the same problem. Temperatures reaching -40 degrees Fahrenheit, with nothing but wood, hide, geometry, and an understanding of cold that in some ways went even deeper. Next, we go inside those structures, and what you find there will change how you think about warmth entirely.